All right, so are you ready to dive into some serious history today? Because we are looking at the story behind the Pentagon Papers.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Our main source material for this deep dive is going to be a Wondery podcast episode all about Daniel Ellsberg.
Very cool.
And just to give you a little preview, this guy's life is, well, it's a wild ride to say the least.
I bet.
I mean, try to picture like the ultimate Cold Warrior,
Yeah.
someone who just radiates patriotism, believes in the American dream with every fiber of his being, and is totally committed to fighting communism like it's his life's mission.
Yeah, like a textbook Cold Warrior.
Exactly. And that's Ellsberg to a T, especially when it comes to the Vietnam War.
I see. So he's like a poster child for America in the 60s, huh?
Oh, absolutely.
Peak Cold War paranoia.
You got it. And you know what makes his story even more interesting is that he's totally gung-ho about the Vietnam War at first.
Really?
He genuinely believes that it's necessary to stop the spread of communism.
So what changes?
Well, as we dig deeper, you'll see how his beliefs undergo a complete transformation.
I'm intrigued.
It's all because he stumbles upon some pretty shocking truths about the war. And let me tell you, Ellsberg is not the kind of guy to stay silent when he sees something wrong.
So he's like a whistleblower.
You could say that he's all about honesty and transparency, especially when it comes to the government.
So this begs the question, how do our beliefs, those deeply held convictions we have, how do those change when we're faced with hard evidence, especially evidence that totally contradicts everything we thought we knew?
This is a tough question for sure.
I mean, Ellsberg's story isn't just about the Vietnam War. It's about this constant struggle between what we believe and what we know to be true.
I think that's a struggle a lot of people can relate to.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's rewind back to Ellsberg's early career and how he gets involved in the Vietnam War in the first place.
Okay, take us back.
So picture this. It's the early 60s, and Ellsberg's working at the Rand Corporation.
Rand Corporation.
Yeah, you know that famous think tank that had a huge influence on Cold War strategy?
Yeah, those guys weren't just academics. They were advising the government on some pretty high-level stuff.
Oh, yeah. They were the brains behind a lot of the big moves during the Cold War.
Wow.
So Ellsberg's there doing his thing, and all of a sudden, he gets summoned to the Pentagon.
Ooh, that sounds serious.
It was. Turns out the Assistant Secretary of Defense, this guy named John McNaughton, wants Ellsberg on his team.
So they need his expertise.
Yeah, they need someone to analyze reports and basically help the U.S. figure out how to handle Vietnam.
I see. So Ellsberg's in high demand.
Oh, yeah, he's a rising star. But he's actually kind of hesitant about the offer at first.
Why is that?
Well, he loves the freedom of working outside the government. He's not really a bureaucrat at heart.
Yeah, I get that.
But McNaughton, this Assistant Secretary of Defense, he's a pretty persuasive guy, and he appeals to Ellsberg's sense of duty.
So he lays on the patriotism.
Exactly. He's like, look, Ellsberg, the stakes are incredibly high. We need brilliant minds like yours to help us win this thing.
That's a tough one to say no to.
For sure. And remember, Ellsberg is a hardcore anti-communist.
Right. That was like his defining characteristic.
Totally. He sees the Soviet Union as this massive threat to freedom and democracy across the world. And he truly believes that stopping the spread of communism, especially in Vietnam, is absolutely crucial.
Okay, so he's got a lot riding on this.
And then, bam, right when he takes the job, the Gulf of Tonkin incident happens.
Oh, wow. Talk about timing.
I know, right? So this U.S. ship gets attacked off the coast of North Vietnam, and it basically throws gasoline on the already raging fire of the Cold War.
Yeah, that was a major turning point.
Totally. The U.S. starts ramping up its involvement in Vietnam like big time, and Ellsberg finds himself thrown right to the heart of it all.
It's like he's stepped into a different world.
Oh, yeah. He went from this intellectual think tank environment to the pressure cooker of the Pentagon overnight.
It's important to remember, though, that the Gulf of Tonkin incident wasn't just some random event.
Right. It was a huge deal.
It played right into the Cold War mindset. Any aggression from communist forces was seen as a direct attack on the U.S. and its allies.
It's no wonder the U.S. responded so quickly.
Yeah, and as we'll see, maybe not always with the most accurate information.
That's a great point, and it really puts things into perspective. So here's Ellsberg working like crazy at the Pentagon, totally dedicated to helping the U.S. win what he believes is a necessary war.
He's all in.
100%. And there's this scene where he's in a room with a direct phone line to Vietnam talking to a colonel on the ground.
Wow. A direct line to the front lines.
Yep. And Ellsberg's desperately trying to gather information, trying to get a handle on what's really happening over there.
I can imagine that's a tough job.
Oh, yeah. It was a chaotic situation. And this is where Ellsberg starts to experience the brutality of the war firsthand, but not in the way you might think.
What do you mean?
Well, a colonel, he starts relaying these horrific stories of Viet Cong atrocities.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, going into graphic detail about the things they were doing to civilians and prisoners of war.
Right.
And it was meant to build support for the war. You know,
Yeah, paint the enemy as monsters.
exactly. Show how ruthless and inhumane they were and justify the U.S. intervention.
Propaganda.
It definitely had that effect. But it also had a profound impact on Ellsberg himself. It fueled his belief that the U.S. absolutely had to win this war to stop this kind of violence.
So he's getting sucked deeper into the conflict.
You could say that, but it also makes you think, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
It all depends on who's telling the story.
Exactly. And the stories Ellsberg hears, they definitely strengthen this narrative that the U.S. is the good guy fighting against a cruel enemy.
That's how wars are often sold to the public.
It's true. And it makes you wonder about how propaganda and information, even if it's true, are used to shape public opinion during wartime.
For sure.
And it makes you question, how can we as individuals be critical of those narratives presented to us and try to find the full story?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely. And things get even more complicated for Ellsberg when President Johnson announces a major escalation of the war in a press conference.
Oh boy, here we go.
Yeah, so Johnson goes on TV and says they're sending 50,000 more troops to Vietnam.
50,000?
But Ellsberg knows that's a lie.
He does?
Yep, he's seen the actual plans, and the real number is double, that 100,000 troops are being deployed.
Wow, that's a huge discrepancy.
It is, and it's our first real glimpse into the government's deception.
And this starts to plant those seeds of doubt in Ellsberg's mind.
Oh yeah, he's starting to question everything he thought he knew.
Remember, this is a man who values honesty above all else.
Exactly, and it's pretty jarring to see the President of the United States standing there telling the public one thing while knowing the truth is something else entirely.
Yeah, it's got to shake your faith in the system.
So Ellsberg, being the kind of guy he is, he confronts his boss, McNaughton, about this discrepancy.
I haven't.
Well, McNaughton basically brushes him off, tells him to trust the president's judgment.
Classic bureaucratic response.
Right, and it's a textbook example of the pressure to conform, especially within a hierarchical system like the government.
It's hard to stink truth to power.
It is, and remember at this point, Ellsberg still believes in the overall mission. So he tries to push those doubts aside.
I see. So he's still trying to reconcile his beliefs with what he's seeing?
Exactly. And to try to truly understand what's happening in Vietnam, Ellsberg decides to see the war for himself.
Wow. He goes to Vietnam.
He does. He travels there and spends time out in the field with soldiers experiencing the horrors of combat firsthand.
And this is where the carefully constructed narrative about the war starts to crumble for him.
It is.
What he sees on the ground clashes with the reports he's been reading and the stories he's been hearing back in Washington.
It's like a reality check.
Exactly.
And unfortunately for Ellsberg, what he sees is not pretty. He returns from Vietnam with this incredibly grim assessment.
What does he think?
He's convinced that the U.S. is headed straight for a stalemate, if not outright defeat.
So he's seeing things that the people back home aren't.
Absolutely. And he tries to share his findings with military leaders in Saigon, but they pretty much ignore him.
They don't want to hear it.
Nope. They're clinging to this idea that victory is just around the corner, that the South Vietnamese army will somehow turn the tide.
This denial of reality is fascinating.
It really is. It's like they're so invested in a particular outcome that they become blind to any evidence that contradicts their beliefs.
Like cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. And it's incredibly frustrating for Ellsberg. He sees the truth, but no one in a position to do anything about it seems to want to hear it.
So he's trapped.
In a way, he's caught between his loyalty to his country and his growing awareness that the war is a disaster.
What a difficult position to be in.
It really is, and this is where Ellsberg's transformation truly begins. He goes from being a staunch supporter of the war to someone who's deeply skeptical.
So he's starting to see the cracks in the system.
Exactly, and those cracks are about to widen a whole lot more.
I can't wait to hear what happens next.
Okay, so we left off with Ellsberg back from Vietnam, and man, he's grappling with some serious stuff. Oh yeah, he's seen the horrors of war firsthand, and he's starting to question everything. Exactly. And this sense of unease, it's not just limited to his professional life. His personal life starts to mirror this growing disillusionment too.
How so?
Well, there's this really powerful scene that takes place at his engagement dinner in Saigon.
His engagement dinner.
Yep. It's meant to be this happy occasion, celebrating his upcoming marriage to Patricia Marks.
Patricia Marks, the journalist.
The one and only. She's a brilliant woman. Yeah. Very outspoken and politically active.
So what happens at the dinner?
Well, they're all gathered there with friends and family, and this military commissioner starts talking about the bombing campaign in North Vietnam.
At the engagement dinner.
I know, right? Talk about a buzzkill, but it gets worse. This guy doesn't hold back at all. He starts describing the destruction of civilian neighborhoods,
Yeah.
the deaths of innocent women and children.
Oh, wow, that's awful.
It was truly horrific, and it shakes Patricia to her core.
Understandably so. I mean, it's one thing to hear about war in abstract terms, but it's another thing entirely to hear about the real human cost, the innocent lives lost.
Exactly, and Patricia being the strong, outspoken woman
Yeah.
she is, she confronts Ellsberg directly.
About the bombing.
Yep. She basically accuses him of being complicit in these atrocities.
Wow, that's a heavy accusation.
It is, she can't understand how he can be a part of this war machine, how he can justify the killing of innocent people, even indirectly.
So she's calling him out on his morals.
Absolutely, and it's a tough moment for Ellsberg. I mean,
Mhm.
he's facing this intense moral dilemma, and the woman he loves is challenging him on it.
That's got to be hard.
It is, it's like his personal and professional worlds are colliding, and it forces him to confront the ethical dimension of his work, something he's been trying to ignore.
I see. So up until this point, he's been focused on the strategic aspects of the war, on winning the fight against communism.
Right, but Patricia's outrage forces him to acknowledge the human cost, the true price of war that goes beyond statistics and battle plans.
She's holding up a mirror to him, making him see the consequences of his actions in a new light.
Exactly, and it leads to this huge argument between them. Patricia is so disgusted that she gives Ellsberg back his ring and walks out.
Oh, wow. So their engagement is off.
It is, at least for now. And this scene, it really underscores the personal toll Ellsberg's involvement in the war. He's losing faith in the war effort, and now he's lost the woman he loves because of it.
It's a turning point for him.
Absolutely. It pushes him further down this path of doubt and questioning, and things get even more complicated when he ends up on a military plane with Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense himself,
Wait, Robert McNamara, the architect of the Vietnam War?
the one and only. And they're having this intense debate about whether the war is improving or getting worse.
So is McNamara having second thoughts?
Well, there's this glimmer of hope in this scene. McNamara, who's been a staunch advocate for the war up until this point, starts expressing his own doubts.
He does?
Yep, he admits that despite sending more troops, the situation in Vietnam isn't improving.
So even McNamara is starting to see the cracks.
It seems that way, and Ellsberg, seeing an opportunity, jumps into the conversation.
He does?
Oh yeah, he shares his own assessment based on his firsthand experience that things are definitely not getting better.
He's being honest.
Brutally honest, and it seems like McNamara is actually listening to him.
So maybe there's hope.
Maybe. But that hope is quickly shattered when the plane lands and there's a press conference waiting for McNamara.
What happens?
Well, McNamara steps up to the microphone and delivers this glowing report about the war, talking about all the progress being made and how victory is just around the corner.
Wait a minute. So he just admitted to having doubts in private, and now he's painting this rosy picture for the public.
It's a complete 180, and it's
Mhm.
clear that McNamara is more concerned with maintaining a positive public image and controlling the narrative than with acknowledging the truth.
Even when he knows it's not true.
It's a classic case of saying one thing in private and another in public, and it makes you wonder about the motivations of those in power. And for Ellsberg, it's a huge disappointment. He's been searching for someone within the government who's willing to listen, to acknowledge the reality of the war, and to act on that truth.
And he thought he'd found that person in McNamara.
For a brief moment, he did. But this whole experience, it further erodes Ellsberg's faith in the system. He's seen the lies, the manipulation, the prioritization of political expediency over truth and accountability.
So he's at a crossroads.
He is disillusioned and unsure of what to do next. But one thing's for sure, he can't stay silent. All right, so we've got Daniel Ellsberg at this major crossroads.
Yeah, he's gone from being a true believer to someone who's totally disillusioned with the government and the war.
Right, and to top it all off, he's sitting on this massive secret, the Pentagon Papers, thousands of pages of classified documents that expose the truth about how the war has been handled and how the public has been misled for years.
It's a huge weight on his shoulders.
It is, and it raises so many questions about morality and responsibility.
Like, what would you do if you were in his shoes?
Seriously, it's a moral dilemma of epic proportions.
Does he stay silent, protect his career, and let the deception continue? Or does he risk everything, his reputation, his freedom to expose the truth?
It's a decision with huge consequences, not just for him, but for the whole country.
It really highlights that tension between individual conscience and the power of institutions.
When do you speak up, even if it means going against the grain?
And at what cost?
Tough questions. And remember, this is the late 60s. The Cold War is in full swing, and there's this intense fear of communism.
Yeah, the government's argument would be that national security is at stake.
Exactly. They'd say revealing these secrets could damage America's standing in the world.
But Ellsberg is starting to believe that the real threat to democracy comes from within.
From a government that's willing to lie to its own people.
A chilling thought.
It is. So at this point, Ellsberg's involved in this top secret project, the study that would become known as the Pentagon Papers.
Right. The one commissioned by McNamara.
Yep. He was trying to figure out how the U.S. had gotten so bogged down in Vietnam.
And Ellsberg sees it as an opportunity
To maybe influence the course of the war from within.
He's still hoping that things can be set right.
He is. But as he dives deeper into these documents, he's just shocked by what he finds.
What does he see?
A pattern of deception going back decades. Multiple administrations misleading the public about the war's goals, the level of U.S. involvement, the chances of success.
Wow, it's way worse than he imagined.
Way worse. And the Pentagon Papers, they reveal this systematic effort to manipulate public opinion.
To justify a war that was becoming increasingly unpopular.
Exactly. And they show that the government was willing to sacrifice lives and resources just to protect its own image to avoid admitting they made a mistake.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
It is. So Ellsberg tries to work within the system. He reaches out to Walt Rostow, the president's national security advisor at the time.
He thinks surely someone at that level will do something.
That's what he's hoping. But Rostow dismisses Ellsberg's concerns completely.
He doesn't want to hear it.
He refuses to even acknowledge the evidence in the Pentagon Papers.
He's more concerned with protecting the president's agenda.
Exactly. And it's incredibly disheartening for Ellsberg.
It's like he's hitting a brick wall.
It is. He's tried everything he can to make a difference from within the government, and he's hit a dead end.
So what does he do?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, because he starts to realize that the only way to expose the truth is to go outside the system.
To go public.
To leak the Pentagon Papers to the press.
Wow, that's a huge risk.
It is risk that could land him in jail,
Yeah.
but he's determined to do what he believes is right.
So he's willing to sacrifice everything for the truth.
He is. And that decision to leak those documents, it sets off a chain reaction that will change American history forever.
It's a pivotal moment.
Absolutely. It sparks this huge debate about the role of the government, the freedom of the press, and the power of individual action.
And it forces the American public to confront some uncomfortable truths about the war.
Ellsberg's story is a powerful reminder that speaking truth to power is never easy.
But it's essential for a functioning democracy.
If you're interested in learning more about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, I highly recommend checking out the Wondery podcast.
It's a fascinating deep dive into one of the most important chapters in American history.
And it raises so many questions that are still relevant today about truth accountability and the responsibility we all have to speak up against injustice, even when it's hard, even when it's risky.
Food for thought, for sure.
It definitely is. Well, that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.